The superego functions like an internal judge, carrying the voice of parents, teachers, and societal rules that once guided behavior and shaped a child's sense of right and wrong. In adulthood, this internal authority often operates unchecked, evaluating every choice through an impossibly strict moral lens. When faced with decisions, big or small, the superego scrutinizes each option for potential errors, moral failures, or social disapproval. This relentless self-critique drives overthinking, as the individual cycles through endless what-if scenarios, imagining ever more dire consequences for any perceived misstep. Choosing a restaurant for dinner can become a debate over dietary virtue, social etiquette, and future regret, while major life decisions, career moves, relationships trigger exhaustive mental lists of pros and cons, each shadowed by the fear of making the wrong choice and incurring guilt. Unlike the ego, which seeks practical solutions, or the ED, which pursues immediate gratification, the superego enforces internalized ideals without reference to practicality or personal preference. Its demands can feel overwhelming because the standards it upholds often exceed what the real world or even the individual's own desires can satisfy. The superego's voice might insist on flawless performance, total self-sacrifice, or unwavering adherence to moral codes. As a result, the decision-maker encounters a paralyzing dilemma. Every option falls short of the superego's ideal, provoking self-reproach before a choice is even made. This inner judge also prevents the person from trusting their own judgment. Because the superego's standards are rooted in external authority figures from childhood, adult self-trust remains undeveloped. When an opportunity arises, the individual doubts their competence and fears internal disapproval as much as external censure. Am I good enough to handle this? What will people think if I fail? Each thought echoes parental critiques or schoolyard judgments once engraved in the psyche. The more rigid and punitive the superego, the greater the hesitation to decide, leading to a chronic state of indecision. Overthinking fueled by the superego manifests in repetitive mental loops. The individual writes detailed lists, researches exhaustively, seeks unlimited input from friends or experts, all attempts to ensure perfection. Yet the superego's demands grow with every new piece of information. If a friend suggests a possible downside, that appears on the list, expanding it further. This quest for certainty is doomed because no amount of information can guarantee a perfectly guilt-free choice. Instead of clarifying, it muddles the landscape, increasing anxiety and reinforcing the sense of being stuck. Freud described the superego as a harsh internal policeman, and its negative effects become clear in decision paralysis. The superego triggers guilt before action, preventing the ego from weighing options realistically. Decisions thus become battlegrounds where fear of guilt overshadows desire for fulfillment. The person may delay starting a project until every potential pitfall is considered, never daring to begin. Even trivial decisions like choosing between two outfits can consume hours as the superego whispers warnings about social judgment or personal vanity. This pattern erodes confidence over time, teaching the individual that indecision feels safer than choice. The mind learns to avoid guilt by delaying action indefinitely. Ironically, the superego's attempt to protect against wrongdoing backfires, creating a state of inaction that itself causes distress, missed opportunities, mounting stress, and a growing sense of self-doubt. The more decisions are avoided, the more powerful and pervasive the superego's hold becomes, feeding a vicious cycle. Breaking this cycle starts with understanding the superego's origins and function. Recognizing its voice as internalized authority rather than absolute truth empowers the individual to question its judgments. By identifying specific superego rules, I must always be certain before choosing, I will feel ashamed if I make a mistake, the person gains the ability to challenge these demands. Naming the superego's critical statements deflates their weight, reminding the ego that these standards are learned rather than innate. In sum, the superego's role in overthinking and decision paralysis stems from its origin as an internalized moral authority. Its unyielding standards and fear-based enforcement create a mental environment where every choice triggers guilt before action. Understanding this dynamic illuminates why indecision happens and paves the way for targeted strategies to rebalance inner judgment and restore confidence in decision-making. Guilt often emerges as an invisible barrier that turns decision-making into a paralyzing ordeal. The superego, acting as the mind's internal moral compass, does more than critique. It generates guilt whenever choices fall short of its rigid standards. This guilt doesn't simply register as a mild discomfort. It floods the psyche with anxiety and self-reproach, creating an inner morass where every option seems tainted by wrongdoing. As a result, the person hesitates endlessly, fearful that any decision will betray core values or provoke condemnation, real or imagined. The process begins when the superego flags potential missteps before a choice is even made. Imagining a career move, for instance, the individual might instantly recall a childhood lesson. You mustn't let people down. That early admonition, internalized as a superego rule, triggers guilt at the thought of leaving the current job, no matter how unsatisfying it is, because departure feels like betrayal. The mind then enumerates every way the decision could harm colleagues, finances, or reputation. This cascade of hypothetical guilt scenarios, each more dire than the last, overwhelms the conscious will, immobilizing action. Guilt also warps time perception. Instead of viewing choices on a continuum of possibilities, the indecisive person fixates on a single worst-case scenario, as though that outcome is inevitable. A decision to move cities becomes suffused with guilt-laden images of homesickness, disrupted family relationships, and wasted resources. The emotional weight of these future regrets is so intense that it outweighs any potential benefits, trapping the person in a perpetual state of preparation without execution. Moreover, guilt-driven paralysis often intersects with guilt avoidance strategies. To escape the superego's condemning voice, the individual may procrastinate, pushing off decisions until the guilt temporarily subsides. Procrastination feels like relief, but only deepens the paralysis because the unresolved choice looms larger over time, intensifying guilt. Each delay becomes yet another cause for self-reproach, reinforcing the cycle. Perfectionism serves as a companion to guilt in creating decision paralysis. When the superego demands not just morally correct choices, but flawless ones, any decision appears flawed. The person cannot simply choose between acceptable options. They must identify the best choice that aligns perfectly with superego imperatives. This unattainable standard guarantees perpetual indecision. If perfection is required, no decision will ever suffice. Guilt's grip extends beyond major life choices to daily routines. Simple tasks, choosing what to eat, deciding on weekend plans, selecting a workout, become laden with moral overtones. Should one choose the indulgent dessert and feel guilty for undermining health goals? Opt for relaxation activities and feel guilty for shirking productivity? In this way, guilt saturates every moment, exhausting mental energy and leaving little capacity for decisive action. On an interpersonal level, guilt-driven paralysis can manifest in social situations. When deciding whether to decline an invitation, the individual may feel guilty about disappointing a friend or neglecting obligations. This guilt inhibits straightforward no responses, leading to overcommitment and regret, further entrenching indecision. The fear of causing emotional harm, rooted in early lessons that kindness meant sacrifice, overrides personal preference, undermining autonomy. Psychologically, guilt activates the same brain circuits associated with pain and distress. Studies show that moral or interpersonal guilt triggers activity in areas linked to physical pain. When contemplating a decision, the mere anticipation of guilt can elicit real discomfort, making the act of choosing as aversive as physical harm. The mind, seeking to avoid this pain, defaults to inaction, cementing paralysis. Addressing guilt-induced stuckness requires recognizing guilt as a signal rather than a verdict. The individual learns to treat guilt feelings as messages pointing to superego standards rather than absolute truths. A moment of hesitation, accompanied by a pang of guilt, becomes a cue to examine which internal rule is at play. Which early lesson is making me feel guilty here? This curiosity reframes guilt from an obstacle into useful information about personal values and internalized authority. Techniques such as guilt journaling help externalize these internal judgments. By noting each instance of guilt, its trigger, the superego's message, and the decision it impedes, the person separates the emotional response from the decision itself. Seeing guilt written down reduces its power, clarifying that the emotion reflects an internalized standard, not an objective certainty about the choice's moral weight. Another approach involves gradual exposure to making imperfect decisions. Starting with low-stakes choices, selecting a less than ideal meal, or choosing a new route home, the individual intentionally accepts minor guilt and observes its fleeting nature. Each small decision builds tolerance for guilt, illustrating that occasional missteps are survivable and even instructive. Over time, this practice weakens the superego's claim to infallibility and reduces guilt's paralyzing hold on more significant decisions. Self-compassion techniques also counteract guilt-driven paralysis. Cultivating a kind inner voice that acknowledges human fallibility helps rebalance counterbalance the harsh superego. Simple exercises such as speaking to oneself as one would to a friend facing the same decision soften self-reproach and encourage action. When guilt arises, the compassionate tone offers reassurance. It's okay to choose imperfectly. You're doing your best. Finally, integrating superego guidance with ego strength fosters balanced decision-making. Rather than seeing guilt as purely negative, the person learns to honor the moral concerns it raises while prioritizing realistic goals and personal values. By negotiating between superego demands and personal desires, asking what choice aligns with both my integrity and my well-being, the individual reclaims agency and moves beyond paralysis. Through these strategies, viewing guilt as information, journaling, gradual exposure to imperfect choices, self-compassion, and negotiating between moral ideals and personal needs, decision paralysis rooted in superego-induced guilt can be transformed. The relentless inner judge finds a balanced partner in a supportive, realistic inner voice, enabling confident choices and a life driven by conscious purpose rather than debilitating self-reproach. Unpacking the superego's demands begins with identifying the internalized rules and critical beliefs that drive overthinking. These rules often originated in early caregiving relationships, where praise, reprimands, or moral lessons set rigid standards. Common superego mandates include always be perfect, never inconvenience others, and avoid mistakes at all costs. To reveal these unconscious injunctions, the individual listens for recurring self-critical statements. A thought like, "I shouldn't even consider that option, it's irresponsible," signals a superego rule about responsibility taken too far. Similarly, "If I choose this, I'll disappoint everyone," exposes internalized expectations of constant approval. Mapping these rules onto their origins provides context and reduces their absolute power. For instance, recalling a parent who rewarded only flawless performance clarifies why striving for perfection feels non-negotiable. A teacher who harshly penalizes small errors can explain why fear of minor mistakes balloons into overwhelming guilt. Documenting these connections in a reflective journal transforms vague self-criticism into concrete patterns. Rule, "I must be flawless." Origin, "Father's praise only when I got top grades." This exercise demystifies the superego, revealing it as a learned voice rather than an intrinsic truth. Next, the individual examines the specific emotions tied to each superego rule. Guilt, shame, or anxiety often accompany thoughts shaped by these rules. By noting bodily sensations, tightness in the chest, knot in the stomach, whenever a superego injunction arises, the person gains somatic awareness of the critical voice's impact. Recognizing this physical response helps link abstract thoughts to real experience, making the critique less abstract and more tangible. This awareness allows for targeted interventions. When the chest tightens at a perfectionistic thought, the person knows which rule has just activated. Analyzing the consequences of superego-driven overthinking clarifies its dysfunctional nature. Chronic indecision wastes time and energy, erodes confidence, and leads to missed opportunities. By listing real-life instances where overanalysis prevented action, delayed career moves, wasted weekends, stalled projects, the person sees the cost of obeying rigid internal demands. This cost-benefit analysis counters the superego's black and white logic by introducing pragmatic considerations. The superego might argue choosing imperfectly is shameful, but the evidence shows delaying decisions caused regrets. A powerful technique for unpacking superego demands is conducting an internal dialogue between the critical superego voice and the compassionate ego. The individual writes down both voices in alternating speech bubbles. The superego voice might say, "You can't risk failure," while the ego counters, "Mistakes are part of learning." This dialogue externalizes internal conflict, making each position explicit. As the ego voice grows more assertive over multiple dialogues, the superego's absolute authority diminishes, revealing it as one side of an ongoing inner debate rather than the sole arbiter. Identifying cognitive distortions embedded in superego judgments further weakens their hold. Superego rules often rest on all-or-nothing thinking. "If I'm not perfect, I'm a failure." Catastrophizing, "One wrong move will ruin everything." And personalization, "If someone disapproves, it's entirely my fault." By recognizing these distortions, the individual can apply cognitive restructuring, challenging "I must be flawless" with evidence of successful outcomes despite imperfections, and reframing mistakes are catastrophic to mistakes are opportunities to improve. Over time, these reframes rewire automatic thoughts, reducing the sting of superego critiques. Finally, grouping related superego rules into thematic clusters highlights overarching belief systems. Perfectionism, people-pleasing, and fear of failure often share the core belief, "I'm not good enough." Identifying this core allows the person to target the root rather than myriad symptoms. Interventions such as affirmations, "I am enough as I am," or therapy exploring self-worth address the foundational issue, easing multiple superego injunctions at once. Unpacking superego demands transforms the internal judge from an unseen tyrant into a recognizable, manageable voice. By mapping rules to origins, linking thoughts to emotions, weighing costs, staging internal dialogues, challenging distortions, and targeting core beliefs, the individual dismantles the superego's absolute power. This critical groundwork makes it possible to introduce balancing techniques that temper self-judgment and foster decisive action. Soften the inner critic by first recognizing its language as a learned voice rather than an absolute truth. When the superego pipes up with admonitions like, "You can't choose that, it's irresponsible," label it mentally as, "That's the critic speaking." This moment of naming breaks the automatic identification with the critique, creating psychological distance. Practice this labeling by silently prefixing self-critical thoughts with "critic says." Doing so interrupts the chain of overthinking, reminding the decision maker that the harsh standards come from an internalized authority figure, not from reality. Next, cultivate self-compassion as a direct counterbalance to guilt-laden self-judgment. Whenever the critic strikes, respond with a gentle affirmation. "Everyone makes imperfect choices. I'm learning." Simple phrases delivered in a calm tone, internally or aloud, bring warmth into the emotional landscape, explicitly soothing the anxiety the superego generates. Over time, these compassionate responses retrain the brain to associate decision-making with kindness rather than condemnation, weakening the critic's power. Engage in graduated exposure to making decisions under uncertainty. Begin with low-stakes choices, picking a new route to work, or choosing a recipe without consulting reviews. After acting, note the actual outcome versus the superego's dire predictions. Typically, real-world consequences prove far less severe than imagined. Recording these prediction versus reality observations reinforces the understanding that the critic's warnings are exaggerated. Gradually progress to more significant decisions, armed with confidence from past experiments that uncertainty can be tolerated and that errors yield valuable lessons rather than moral failures. Incorporate ritualized mini-deadlines for decisions. The superego often exploits open-ended choices to prolong overthinking. Assign a firm but reasonable time frame, say 10 minutes for a simple choice, 1 evening for a moderate decision. When the timer expires, decide on the best available option, accepting that perfection is unattainable. Use a gentle self-promise, "I choose within this time, trusting my best judgment." This practice limits the critic's room to amplify doubt and trains the mind to pivot from analysis to action. Utilize visualization to integrate both superego standards and personal desires. Find a quiet place and close the eyes. Imagine two figures, the strict internal judge on one side and the supportive self on the other. Visualize a scale between them. Inhale and tune into the self's voice, preferences, values, intuitive feelings. Exhale and acknowledge the critic's concerns. Consciously adjust the scale to an equilibrium where moral integrity and personal well-being coexist. Practicing this inner balancing act before important choices fosters harmony between guidance and autonomy, reducing paralysis. Adopt journal prompts specifically designed to rebalance judgment. Each evening, write responses to, "What choice did I face today? What did my critics say? How did I respond? And what did I learn?" This structured reflection highlights progress, diminishes obsessive replay of errors, and builds a record of successful decisions made despite the critic's objections. Reviewing entries weekly reveals patterns in superego demands and demonstrates the individual's growing capacity for balanced choice. Invite a friendly inner ally to join the decision-making process. Picture a trusted mentor, historical figure, or compassionate friend in the mind's eye offering practical, non-judgmental advice. Before deciding, ask the inner ally, "What advice would you give?" The ally's supportive suggestions counter the critic's harsh verdicts, introducing alternative perspectives and encouraging action rooted in real values rather than guilt. Over time, this inner alliance strengthens the ego's confidence and dilutes the critic's influence. Create an evidence container for superego criticisms. Keep a small box or digital file where each time the critic issues an ultimatum, "If you choose this, you're terrible," you write the statement on a slip of paper and place it inside. Over weeks, the container fills with critical remarks. When feeling overwhelmed, review a few collected notes, laughing or shaking your head at their absurd extremity. This externalization and light-hearted confrontation reveal how exaggerated the critic's messages are and remove their grip on the psyche. Finally, involve supportive others in a decision partnership. Choose a friend or coach who understands the struggle with chronic indecision. Share superego-driven fears before making a choice. Invite them to challenge the critic's statements with reality-based questions. Is failing really catastrophic? What's the worst that can happen? Their external perspective breaks the critic's isolation, providing grounding truth and reducing the critic's unchecked power. By combining these techniques, labeling the critic, practicing self-compassion, graduated exposure, mini deadlines, balanced visualization, reflective journaling, inner ally dialogues, evidence containers, and decision partnerships, the inner judge's rigidity softens. The superego's role shifts from tyrannical overseer to one of many helpful voices, and the decision-maker reclaims confidence to act. As the internal climate warms from judgment to understanding, indecision yields to deliberate, balanced choices anchored in integrity and self-trust. Rebalancing inner judgment transforms the superego from a tyrannical overseer into a helpful guide that informs decisions without freezing action. The first strategy is to create an inner council of voices, giving structured space for the superego, the ID, and the ego to speak. The superego articulates concerns, ethical implications, long-term consequences, while the id expresses instinctual desires, immediate enjoyment, personal satisfaction. The ego's task is to negotiate between these inputs, crafting decisions that honor moral standards without ignoring personal needs. By explicitly engaging all three parts, the individual shifts evaluation from a solitary, guilt-driven critique into a balanced deliberation. Writing each voice's perspective in separate columns on paper helps visualize the dialogue, ensuring that no single voice dominates. A second approach involves setting clear decision criteria that align with core values rather than external perfection ideals. The person identifies 2 to 4 fundamental priorities, such as integrity, growth, and well-being, that matter most. When facing a choice, they check each option against these criteria, asking, "Does this align with my values?" This process anchors judgment in deeply held beliefs rather than superego injunctions learned in childhood. Decisions become expressions of authentic values instead of futile attempts to satisfy unrealistic standards. Over time, this values-based framework trains the mind to evaluate choices on personally meaningful metrics, smoothing the path to action. Third, imposing good enough deadlines counters endless analysis. For each decision, the individual commits to a deadline by which a choice will be made, accepting that good enough is sufficient. This deadline respects practical needs while allowing the ego to deliberate within realistic bounds. After deciding, the person notes the outcome and any lessons learned, reinforcing that timely action outweighs unending perfection. Good enough deadlines foster momentum, building confidence in one's ability to choose without succumbing to superego-induced guilt. Fourth, practicing moral licensing helps integrate superego guidance without paralysis. Moral licensing is the phenomenon where past virtuous behavior grants permission for less virtuous actions. The individual intentionally performs a small moral act, volunteering time, offering genuine praise, before making a personal decision that might feel self-indulgent. This preemptive ethical action satisfies the superego's demand for moral integrity, freeing the ego to pursue personal goals without steep guilt. Over time, moral licensing recalibrates the superego, teaching it that moral and personal fulfillment can coexist rather than compete. Fifth, employing mindfulness-based, decentering techniques softens the superego's grip. During decision-making, the person practices observing their thoughts as mental events rather than objective truths. Phrases like, "I notice a thought saying I'm irresponsible," foster detachment from the harsh inner judge. By routinely practicing decentering through meditation or brief mindfulness pauses, the individual weakens identification with critical thoughts reducing their emotional impact. Mindful observation cultivates an attitude of curiosity and acceptance toward inner judgment, transforming criticism into information rather than imperatives. Another powerful method involves writing self-forgiveness letters. After making a decision, even one that feels imperfect, the individual composes a letter to themselves acknowledging the choice's context, expressing compassion for any mistakes, and affirming lessons learned. This ritual externalizes self-compassion and counters self-criticism, reinforcing the capacity to act despite superego fears. Over time, these letters build a reservoir of self-forgiveness that cushions future decisions, making guilt less immobilizing. Implementing peer accountability further balances judgment with action. The person shares upcoming decisions with a trusted friend or mentor, explaining superego concerns and personal goals. The accountability partner listens, offers perspective, and encourages timely action, challenging paralyzing thoughts with pragmatic questions. What's the best next step? What have you already learned? This external sounding board reduces isolation, provides reality checks, and counters the superego's tendency to inflate risks. Finally, nurturing a growth mindset reframes mistakes as opportunities rather than moral failures. By reminding themselves that errors drive learning and that mastery emerges through trial and error, the individual shifts internal judgment from condemnation to curiosity, regularly reviewing decisions, successful and otherwise, with reflective questions like what worked, what didn't, what will I try next time, reinforces adaptive learning. Viewing choices as experiments diminishes fear of failure, empowering the ego to act with confidence rather than cower under superego scrutiny. Together, these strategies cultivate a balanced inner environment where judgment and autonomy coalesce. The inner council provides a structured decision-making process. Values-based criteria ground choices in authenticity. Good enough deadlines maintain forward momentum. Moral licensing honors ethics while permitting personal fulfillment. Mindfulness decentering diffuses critical voices. Self-forgiveness, letters build compassion. Peer accountability offers external support, and a growth mindset transforms mistakes into insights. As these practices take root, the superego evolves from an unrelenting critic into a wise advisor, guiding decisions without suffocating action. Decision paralysis gives way to deliberate, confident choice, unlocking the individual's capacity to live by both principle and purpose.